The sun over the Malheur Plateau does not merely shine, it punishes. By the middle of July, the sky over eastern Oregon loses its blue, fading into a hazy, bleached white that looks like the eye of a cataract. It is a predatory heat, a silent, heavy weight that settles over the rolling hills and the dust-choked draws until the very air feels like it has been stripped of its life. For Marcus Henderson, a man whose family had pulled a living from this unforgiving dirt for 3 generations, the heat was no longer just a seasonal adversary. It had become a debt collector coming to claim the last of his pride and the remains of his heritage. Marcus stood at the edge of his north acreage, his boots sinking into a soil that had reached a state of thermal exhaustion. The earth was cracked in deep, jagged fissures, patterns that looked like the shattered glass of a window pane. He looked down at a thermometer he had thrust into the ground earlier that morning. The needle was hovering at 108 degrees, and it was only 10 o'clock. This was the death zone. At this temperature, the microscopic life that makes soil fertile begins to cook. The mycorrhizal fungi, the beneficial bacteria, the tiny engineers of the subterranean world were all being sterilized by a sun that refused to blink. Across the fence line, a cloud of dust announced the arrival of his neighbors. Silas Miller and Elias Vance pulled their battered Ford up to the perimeter, the engine idling with a rhythmic metallic knock that sounded like a funeral drum. They didn't get out, they just sat there, leaning their elbows out of the windows, watching Marcus work. They watched as a flatbed truck, the 4th one that morning, backed up to the edge of the field and began to tilt its bed. A waterfall of white stones, thousands of them, tumbled onto the parched earth with a sound like breaking porcelain. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and shook his head. "Marcus, you've finally done it," he called out, his voice thin and dry. "We thought the heat had just touched your brain, but it looks like it's gone and melted the whole thing. Are you planning on building a monument to your failure? Or are you just trying to blind the God who stopped sending us rain?" Elias laughed, a short, barking sound. "He thinks he's going to grow a crop of marbles. Silas, look at him. He's burying the best silt loam in the county under a pile of driveway gravel. It's a bold strategy, Marcus. Most people want their dirt to be brown, but I guess white is the new color of surrender." Marcus didn't look up. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't tell them about the papers he had stayed up reading until his eyes bled in the dim light of his study. He didn't explain the physics of light or the thermal properties of crystalline quartz. He just picked up a shovel and began the backbreaking work of spreading the stones. He could have listened to the bank when they suggested he sell the equipment and take the insurance payout. He could have followed the lead of the younger farmers who were packing their trailers and heading for the humid valleys of the Willamette. He could have admitted that the climate had moved beyond his ability to manage it, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of white limestone. He felt its coolness, even in the direct glare of the sun. He knew that beneath the mockery of his neighbors and the harsh judgment of the community, there was a secret waiting to be unlocked. The skepticism of the community wasn't born of malice, but of a desperate, shared fear. In a farming town, when one man goes rogue, it feels like a betrayal of the collective struggle. They needed Marcus to fail because if he succeeded, it meant that their own suffering was optional. It meant that the old ways, the ways of their fathers and grandfathers, were no longer the only truth. To the men in the trucks, Marcus wasn't just a farmer with a strange idea. He was a mirror reflecting their own obsolescence. Marcus Henderson was 60 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of the very basalt cliffs that rimmed the plateau. He was a man of few words and deep calculations. His journey toward the white stones hadn't begun in a moment of madness, but in a moment of absolute, crushing clarity 2 years prior. It was the year of the Great Desiccation, a summer where the temperature stayed above 100 degrees for 40 consecutive days. He had stood in his fields and watched his corn crop, his entire year's income literally mummify on the stalk. He remembered the sound of that crop dying. It wasn't a silent death. It was a dry, rasping rustle as the leaves curled into tight, brown needles, trying to protect their last molecules of moisture. He had spent a fortune on irrigation, pumping the deep aquifer until the pumps groaned and the electricity bills threatened to swallow the farm, but it hadn't mattered. The water he put on the soil during the day would evaporate in minutes, leaving behind a crust of mineral salts that further poisoned the ground. The water he put on at night would be sucked out by the dry wind before the sun even rose. He had realized then that he wasn't fighting a water problem, he was fighting a heat problem. You can give a man all the water in the world, but if you leave him standing on a hot stove, he's still going to burn. The soil was the stove. By absorbing the sun's radiation, the dark earth was turning into a thermal battery, storing heat and releasing it directly into the delicate root systems of his plants. He needed a way to turn the stove off. The research began in the winter. While the other farmers were at the Grange Hall complaining about the price of diesel, Marcus was in the basement of the regional university library 3 hours away. He had always been a man who looked for the mechanical cause of things. If a tractor broke, he didn't pray over it. He took the engine apart until he found the sheared pin. He approached the climate with the same cold, analytical eye. He stumbled upon a series of papers regarding the ancient agricultural practices of the Nabateans in the Negev Desert and the Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest. These were civilizations that had flourished in environments far harsher than Oregon. They didn't have pumps or plastic liners. What they had was stone. They used lithic mulch's thick layers of volcanic rock or gravel to cover their planting beds. The papers described how these stone blankets did three things. They prevented evaporation, they condensed nighttime humidity into dew, and most importantly, they regulated temperature. But Marcus took it a step further. He began studying the albedo effect. He learned that a dark surface, like the rich volcanic soil of his farm, absorbs up to 90% of the solar radiation that hits it. A white surface, however, can reflect up to 80% of that same energy back into space. He began to run the numbers on his kitchen table, scribbling in a ledger that had once belonged to his grandfather. If he could cover the ground with a material that was both insulating and highly reflective, he could theoretically create a pocket of the Pacific Northwest in the middle of a desert. He spent months testing different materials in his small backyard garden. He tried wood chips, but they decayed and sucked nitrogen from the soil. He tried straw, but the high winds of the plateau blew it into the next county. He tried black plastic, but it only made the soil hotter, cooking the roots like a sous vide. Then he found the stones. Not just any stones, but a specific grade of high silica white quartz and light-colored limestone. He found a quarry 200 miles away that produced a byproduct of crushed river rock, sorted to a size of 2 to 3 inches. It was heavy enough to resist the wind, porous enough to allow the soil to breathe, and white enough to be seen from orbit. The planning process was an exercise in logistical obsession. He calculated that to cover 20 acres to a depth of 4 inches, he would need nearly 8,000 tons of stone. The cost was astronomical. To fund the project, Marcus did the unthinkable. He sold the back 40, a piece of land that had been in the Henderson names since the Homestead Act. The town whispered that he was selling the body to buy a new suit for the ghost. His daughter, Sarah, who lived in Portland and worked as an environmental engineer, came home for a weekend to try and talk him out of it. "Dad," she said, standing in the kitchen where the smell of sourdough and old wood usually brought comfort but now felt tense and clinical, "you're talking about changing the thermodynamics of an entire landscape. Even if the physics are right, the labor alone will kill you. You're 60 years old. You can't move 8,000 tons of rock by hand." Marcus looked at her, his eyes clear and steady. "I'm not moving it by hand, Sarah. I'm moving it by necessity. If I don't do this, the farm is already dead. I'm just giving it a chance to decide if it wants to live." He showed her his diagrams. He had designed a specialized spreader that could be towed behind his old Massey Ferguson, a device that would lay the stone in precise rows while leaving a narrow channel for the seeds. He had calculated the thermal conductivity of the quartz. He had even mapped the sun's angle throughout the growing season to ensure the shadows cast by the stones would provide micro-shade for the emerging sprouts. The preparation phase took the entire spring. While his neighbors were out dissing their fields and planting their rows in the traditional manner, Marcus was transforming his farm into a construction site. He spent weeks preparing the subsoil, enriching it with deep layer organic matter and slow-release nutrients. He knew that once the stones were down, he wouldn't be able to till the earth again for a decade. He was building a permanent system, a living machine made of mineral and biology. He encountered his first major setback in April. The quarry owner called to say the price of transport had doubled due to fuel surcharges. Marcus sat in his dark living room, the ledger open before him. He could have scaled back the project. He could have covered only 5 acres instead of 20. He could have used cheaper, gray basalt from a local pit, but he didn't. He knew that the gray stone would absorb heat, defeating the entire purpose of the albedo shift. He went to the bank and took out a high-interest bridge loan, putting his house up as collateral. The loan officer, a man Marcus had known for 30 years, sighed as he pushed the paperwork across the desk. "Marcus, I'm signing this because your credit is perfect, but I feel like I'm handing a rope to a man on a bridge." The implementation began in May, and with it came the true weight of the community's ridicule. It wasn't just Silas and Elias anymore. It was the whole town. At the hardware store, they called him the alchemist. At the diner, the morning coffee crew would stop talking when he walked in, the silence heavier than any insult. They saw his white fields as an affront to the dignity of farming. To them, farming was a struggle against the earth, a battle won with sweat and steel. To cover the earth and stone felt like cheating, or worse, like giving up. Marcus worked from dawn until the stars were the only white things left in the sky. The physical toll was immense. The vibration of the tractor and the weight of the stone spreader wore on his joints. His hands became a map of scars and cracks, the limestone dust drying his skin until it felt like parchment. But he was fueled by a strange, quiet adrenaline. Every afternoon, he would take his infrared thermometer out to the field. He would point it at the bare soil of the fence line, which would read 115 degrees. Then he would point it at the soil beneath his first layer of white stones. 82 degrees, a 33-degree difference. In the world of biology, that is the difference between a desert and a garden. It was the proof he needed to keep going. He documented the measurements in his notebook, his handwriting shaky but precise. He recorded the humidity levels, the wind speed, and the light intensity. He was building a database of hope in a season of despair. By the time the first week of June arrived, the build was in full swing and the technical challenges were mounting. The stone spreader he had built began to fail under the abrasive grit of the quartz. The steel plates were being ground down as if by a giant whetstone. He had to spend his nights in the shed, welding hardened manganese steel onto the wear points, his eyes burning from the flash of the arc. He also realized that the weight of the stone was compacting the soil more than he had anticipated. He had to innovate on the fly, creating a floating hitch system that distributed the weight of the spreader across a wider footprint. Every day was a new problem to solve, a new reason to quit. He could have walked away. He could have let the rocks sit in a pile and admitted the critics were right. But he didn't. He worked until the 20 acres were a shimmering, blinding sea of white. The visual impact was staggering. From the ridge above the valley, the Henderson farm looked like a glitch in the landscape. It was a perfect, sharp-edged rectangle of brilliant white set against the dull, thirsty browns and grays of the surrounding territory. It was beautiful and alien. As the planting season began, Marcus used a modified grain drill with heavy-duty openers that could slice through the stone layer and drop the seeds into the cool, dark earth below. He chose a variety of heirloom corn and deep-rooting legumes, plants that were hardy but had no chance in the traditional heat of the plateau. The day he finished planting, Silas Miller walked over to the fence. He looked at the white expanse, then at Marcus. "You've buried it all, Marcus. You've buried the history of this place. I hope you're happy with your rock garden." Because when the July sun really hits, those stones are going to turn into coals and you're going to be standing in the middle of a giant barbecue. Marcus just wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the horizon. He felt the cool air rising from the stones, a gentle breath of moisture that shouldn't have existed in that dry air. He didn't say a word. He just waited for the heat to come. The transition from the preparation to the actual implementation of the lithic mulch was not a single event, but a grueling, month-long siege against physical exhaustion and the mounting weight of public doubt. Week 4 of the build began with a mechanical failure that would have broken a lesser man. The primary conveyor on the stone spreader, a machine Marcus had spent all winter fabricating from salvaged parts, sheared its drive shaft under the relentless weight of the high-density quartz. He stood in the middle of the white field, the sun already screaming at 98 degrees by 9 in the morning, looking at the twisted metal. He could have seen it as an omen. He could have seen it as the land itself rejecting his intervention, but he didn't. He crawled under the machine, the heat reflecting off the white stones and hitting his face like a blast furnace, and began to dismantle the assembly. The technical specifications of the stones were becoming a local obsession, though not for the reasons Marcus would have hoped. At the general store, Silas Miller would hold court, describing the madness in detail. "He's not just putting rocks down," Silas told the gathered men. "He's sorting them by size like he's making jewelry. He's got 3 different piles, one for the base layer, one for the thermal gap, and that blinding white quartz for the top. He's spent for hours yesterday just calibrating the depth of the limestone near the drainage ditch. The man has lost the rhythm of the seasons and replaced it with a calculator." The men laughed, but there was a flicker of something else in their eyes, a fear that the traditional knowledge of their fathers, the knowledge that told them to keep the soil black and turned, was failing them. Marcus didn't care about their rhythm, he cared about the delta. That was the word that repeated in his mind. Delta, the difference between life and death. By week 5, he had perfected the layering technique. The bottom 2 inches consisted of crushed limestone, which provided a porous, alkaline buffered base that allowed for gas exchange between the soil and the atmosphere. The top 2 inches were the crystalline white quartz sourced from the high mountain quarries of the Cascades. This was the shield. Its albedo was measured at 0.78, meaning 78% of all incoming solar radiation was bounced back into the sky before it could ever touch the Earth. He moved with a mechanical precision that bordered on the obsessive. He had to ensure that the stones were not just dumped, but settled. He developed a vibrating harrow system that gently agitated the stones as they were laid, allowing the smaller particles to settle into the gaps and creating a dense, interlocking carpet. This prevented the fierce, dry katabatic winds that rolled off the plateau from shifting his protective layer. He was creating a crust of mineral armor. The dialogue with the skeptics became more pointed as the green shoots began to rise through the white. It was mid-June, and the first of the corn had reached for inches. Elias Vance stopped his tractor at the fence line one afternoon, watching as Marcus used a specialized moisture probe. "Those plants look confused, Marcus," Elias shouted over the rumble of his engine. "They're surrounded by snow in the middle of a heat wave. You think they know which way is up." Marcus stood up, his back cracking with a sound like a dry branch. "They know it's cool down there. Elias, that's all a plant needs to know." Elias shook his head. "Plants need heat to grow, Marcus. Everyone knows that. You're keeping them in a refrigerator. They'll be stunted. They'll never make ear." But the measurements told a different story. While the traditional fields in the valley were showing soil temperatures of 105 degrees at the root zone, Marcus's thermometers were recording a steady, miraculous 68 degrees. He was effectively moving his farm 1,000 miles north or 5,000 feet up in elevation without ever leaving the plateau. He could have explained the metabolic efficiency of plants at lower temperatures. He could have talked about how high soil heat causes roots' own hypoxia and shuts down the plant's ability to take up nutrients. He could have told them that his corn wasn't stunted. It was thriving because it wasn't spending all its energy trying not to die. But he didn't. He just recorded the numbers in his ledger and kept moving. The crisis didn't arrive with a bang, but with a terrifying, heavy silence. In late June, the National Weather Service began issuing warnings about a heat dome of unprecedented magnitude. A high-pressure system was expected to park itself over the region, trapping a mass of desert air and compressing it, heating it further every day. The predicted temperatures were 115, then 118, then a number no one in Oregon wanted to see, 122 degrees. As the heat dome settled in, the sensory details of the valley changed. The smell of the air became metallic, scorched. The birds, usually loud in the morning, went completely silent, huddling in the deep shade of the basalt cliffs. The very light of the sun changed color, turning a bruised, angry yellow-orange as it filtered through the dust of dying farms. Marcus watched as his neighbors' crops began to surrender. The wheat in the neighboring fields didn't just wilt, it shattered. You could walk into a field and touch a stalk, and it would turn to powder in your hand. The tension in the community reached a breaking point. At the town council meeting, men who had been friends for 40 years were snapping at each other, arguing over water rights and pump schedules. The local creek had dropped to a trickle, and the main irrigation canal was being rationed. Marcus didn't attend the meetings, he didn't need the water. His stone mulch had created a closed-loop system. At night, the temperature of the stones dropped rapidly, while the air remained warm and held a tiny amount of moisture. As that air moved through the cool stones, it reached its dew point. Beneath the white quartz, the limestone was literally dripping with condensed water every morning. He was harvesting the air. The extreme conditions were a laboratory of survival. Marcus spent the hottest part of the day, 3 in the afternoon, standing in the middle of his field. He wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and carried a thermal imaging camera he had bought with the last of his savings. The screen was a nightmare of colors. The fence posts were glowing purple-white, registering 140 degrees. The bare paths between the neighboring fields were a solid wall of red. But his beautiful, alien white rose were a cool, deep blue. He could have felt a sense of triumph as he looked at the screen, but all he felt was a profound, heavy responsibility. He was seeing the future of the planet, and it was a cold, hard, white landscape. He thought about his father, who had believed that the earth was a mother that would always provide if you treated her with respect. Marcus realized that the mother was sick, and he was no longer a son. He was a surgeon applying a cold compress to a fever that wouldn't break. The crisis deepened when the power grid began to fail. The sheer demand for air conditioning in the cities and irrigation pumps in the valley caused a series of rolling blackouts. Silas Miller's electric pumps went silent on the 3rd day of the 120-degree peak. He stood by his dry pipes, watching as his 500 acres of premium potatoes turned into baked tubers in the ground. The smell of rotting vegetation began to drift across the valley, the scent of 1,000 dreams fermenting in the heat. On the 4th day of the peak, the wind picked up. It wasn't a cooling breeze. It was a sirocco, a dry, howling gale that carried the grit of the Mojave. This was the moment Marcus had feared. If the wind moved the stones, his shield would be gone. He went out into the gale, his eyes protected by goggles, and watched. The interlocking system held. The weight of the limestone base provided the ballast, while the jagged edges of the quartz top layer kept the wind from getting a purchase. The stones stayed, and the corn beneath them, now 4 feet tall and a dark, healthy green, didn't even shimmy. The visual contrast during the crisis was something the local newspapers would later call the Henderson Miracle. Photographers from the state capitol drove out, their cameras struggling with the dynamic range of the scene. They captured images of Marcus's farm, a brilliant, glowing white rectangle of life surrounded by a landscape that looked like it had been through a nuclear winter. In the photos, the green of the corn looked almost fake, too vibrant to be real against the scorched earth. The validation began not with a government report or a scientific award, but with a knock on Marcus's door at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was Silas Miller. The man looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. His skin was gray with dust, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Marcus," he said, his voice a ghost of its former self. "I've lost everything. The potatoes are gone, the wheat is gone. Even the weeds are dead, but I walked past your north fence tonight. I reached under those rocks of yours." Silas paused, his lower lip trembling. "It was cold, Marcus. It was cold like a cellar." "How is it cold?" Marcus invited him in. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind Silas of the jokes about giants' cemeteries. He sat him down at the kitchen table, poured two glasses of water from his well, which was still holding steady because he wasn't overpumping, and he began to explain the physics. He showed him the ledger. He showed him the temperatures. He showed him that he had used 60% less water than any other farm in the county, yet his plants were growing at twice the rate. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. He had been fighting the wrong war. He had been trying to outpump the sun when he should have been trying to outthink it. Within days, other neighbors began to arrive. They didn't come to mock anymore. They came like pilgrims to a shrine. They brought their own thermometers, wanting to see the numbers for themselves. They knelt in the white stones, pushing their hands into the cool earth, and Marcus saw grown men weep at the sensation. As the heat dome finally began to dissipate, leaving behind a valley of ruined harvests and bankrupt families, Marcus Henderson's 20 acres stood as a beacon of what was possible. When the harvest finally came in late September, the results were staggering. The traditional yield for corn in the plateau was roughly 180 bushels per acre in a good year. In this year of catastrophe, the valley average was less than 40. Marcus harvested 360 bushels per acre. He hadn't just survived the crisis, he had doubled the production of a normal year. The ears of corn were massive, perfectly formed, and filled with a sweetness that came from a plant that had never known a day of stress. The nitrogen levels in the soil, protected from the volatilizing heat by the stone mulch, were higher than they had been when he started. The biological activity in the soil was teeming. When he pulled back the stones to harvest, he found earthworms near the surface, something unheard of in the high plateau in September. The legacy of the white stones began that winter. Marcus didn't patent his spreader or hide his data. He opened his doors. He turned his barn into a classroom. He spent his evenings showing his neighbors how to calculate their own albedo requirements, how to source the right minerals, and how to build their own floating hitches. He told them that the era of the open, black field was over. "We have to dress the earth," he told them. "We have to give her a coat if we want her to keep us warm, and a shield if we want her to keep us cool." Within 3 years, the Malheur Plateau changed color. From the air, it no longer looked like a patchwork of brown and gold. It looked like a mosaic of white and green. Other farmers adapted the technique, using light-colored volcanic pumice or crushed sea shells depending on what was available. They found that the technique worked for orchards, for vineyards, and for vegetable rows. The Henderson method became the standard for arid land agriculture across the West. The long-term impact was historical. The plateau, once on the verge of being abandoned to the desert, became one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country. The water table began to recover as irrigation demands plummeted. The local microclimate even began to shift as the thousands of acres of white stones reflected enough energy to slightly reduce the ambient nighttime temperatures of the entire valley. Marcus Henderson lived to be 90. He spent his final years sitting on his porch, looking out over a sea of white that stretched to the horizon. He saw the children of the men who had mocked him now tending to their own stone-covered fields. He had taught them that innovation isn't about the newest chemical or the most expensive machine. It's about understanding the fundamental language of the world, the language of light, heat, and survival. He left behind a world that was cooler, greener, and more resilient. His philosophy was simple. The earth is not something we own, but something we negotiate with. And sometimes the best way to win a negotiation is to bring a few million white stones to the table. The lesson of the Henderson farm remains a profound testament to the power of the individual mind to stand against the tide of tradition and the heat of a changing world. It is a story of how one man, ridiculed and broke, looked at a handful of white rock and saw the salvation of a people. The acquisition of the stones was not merely a financial transaction. It was a journey into the geological history of the continent. Marcus Henderson spent for days at the Odhi Quarry, standing amidst the towering walls of ancient basalt and the veins of high-purity silica. He didn't just want white rocks, he wanted a specific mineral composition. He understood that the limestone he sought, the calcium carbonate base, had to be of a certain density, roughly 2.7 grams per cubic centimeter. This density was critical because it determined the thermal mass. If the stone was too light, it would heat up too quickly. If it was too heavy, it would retain the day's heat far into the night, radiating it back into the soil and cooking the roots after the sun had set. He spent hours with the quarry's head geologist, a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, looking at spectroscopic data. They analyzed the silica content of the quartz. Marcus was looking for a silica purity of at least 95%. This wasn't for aesthetic reasons. High-purity silica has a unique crystalline structure that allows it to reflect short-wave solar radiation while remaining transparent to long-wave thermal radiation. It was, in essence, a one-way mirror for heat. He could have settled for the gray river rock found in the local creek beds. He could have used the cheaper volcanic scoria that was abundant in the valley, but he didn't. He knew that the scoria, with its dark color and high surface area, would act as a heat trap. He needed the white quartz to act as a barrier, reflecting the light before it could be converted into heat. The logistics of moving 8,000 tons of stone became a legendary feat of local endurance. Marcus hired 3 independent truckers, men who were desperate for work as their own farms were failing. They made 84 trips each, hauling the stones over the winding mountain passes. Each load was weighed and inspected. Marcus would stand at the entrance of his farm with a Geiger counter and a pH strip, testing samples from every truck. He was looking for mineral stability. He knew that as the limestone weathered, it would slowly release calcium and magnesium into the soil, acting as a natural buffer against the acidification that often accompanies high-temperature evaporation. He was building a soil enrichment system that would last for a century. The engineering of the stone spreader was where Marcus's mechanical genius truly shone. He realized that a standard manure spreader would simply grind itself to pieces within hours. The abrasive nature of quartz is such that it can cut through mild steel like a file. Marcus went to the local scrap yard and salvaged the hardened manganese steel plates from a decommissioned rock crusher. He spent 68 hours straight in his workshop, his welding mask never lifting except for sips of black coffee. He fabricated a triple-reinforced hopper with a gravity-fed vibratory floor. The vibration was the key. By oscillating the floor of the spreader at a frequency of 30 Hz, he ensured that the stones didn't just fall, they settled. They were arranged by the vibration, with the smaller limestone pieces filling the voids between the larger quartz stones. This created a near-perfect seal against the atmosphere. He could have used a simple conveyor belt. He could have hired a crew of laborers with shovels, but he didn't. He knew that manual labor would result in uneven depth, and an uneven depth meant thermal leaks. A single patch of bare earth could act like a thermal chimney, drawing heat into the cool sublayer and destabilizing the entire field. The community's reaction to the great spreading moved from mockery to a kind of hushed, grim fascination. At the town's only diner, the Copper Kettle, the morning talk was no longer about the weather, but about Marcus's math. "He's got charts," Silas Miller told the crowd, his voice hushed as if he were talking about a cult leader. "He's got charts showing the sun's angle for every day of the year. He says the stones have to be exactly 4.2 inches deep on the south-facing slopes and only 3.8 on the north. He says it's all about the incident angle." The men leaned in, their coffee getting cold. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the conviction. There is nothing more unsettling to a man than a neighbor who has found a truth that makes his own reality look like a lie. As the heat wave began to build in late June, the biological drama intensified. Marcus was monitoring the stomatal conductance of his corn plants. Most people think plants die in the heat because they run out of water. Marcus knew the truth was more complex. In extreme heat, a plant's stomata, the tiny pores on the leaves, close to prevent water loss. But when they close, the plant can no longer take in carbon dioxide. The plant essentially starves to death while standing in the sun. However, because Marcus's soil was kept at a steady 68 degrees, the root systems were sending signals to the leaves that the water supply was secure and the environment was stable. His corn kept its stomata open even when the air temperature hit 110 degrees. It was performing C for carbon fixation at peak efficiency. While the neighboring corn was turning yellow and brittle, Marcus's corn was a deep blue-green, pulsing with life. He could have used chemical growth regulators to help the plants cope with the stress. He could have used shade cloths or expensive misting systems. But he didn't. He trusted the thermodynamics of the stone. He had created a subterranean sanctuary where the roots could function in a perpetual spring, even as the world above turned into a furnace. The psychological pressure on Marcus during the peak of the crisis was immense. The town's water commissioner, a man named Grady Thorne, came to the farm on the fourth day of the 120-degree heat. He was there to shut off Marcus's irrigation allotment. "Marcus, I've got no choice," Grady said, wiping sweat from his eyes with a handkerchief that was already soaked. "The river is a mud flat. We're prioritizing human consumption and livestock. You can't pump another drop." Marcus didn't argue. He just led Grady out to the field. He knelt down and pulled back a section of the white stones. Beneath the rocks, the soil was dark and visibly moist. Marcus took a handful and squeezed it. Water trickled between his fingers. Grady stared, his mouth hanging open, but, "We haven't had rain in 3 months, and you haven't turned your pumps on in weeks," Grady stammered. Marcus explained the condensation effect. At night, the temperature of the quartz stones would drop to 55 degrees, while the air remained at 85. The moisture in the air would hit the stones, reach its dew point, and condense. He was pulling 30 gallons of water per acre out of the air every single night. He was literally making rain out of the dry Oregon wind. Grady didn't shut off the water. He just walked away, shaking his head and muttering about miracles. The crisis also brought out the darker side of the community. Desperation breeds resentment. A group of younger farmers, their legacies crumbling in the heat, gathered at the tavern one night. They talked about how Marcus was hoarding the coolness. They talked about how the reflection from his white stones was making their own farms hotter, a scientific impossibility, but a psychological reality for men looking for a scapegoat. There were whispers of sabotage. One night, Marcus found a group of men at his gate with bags of black soot, planning to spray his white fields and turn them into heat absorbers. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't come out with a shotgun. He simply walked out with a pitcher of ice water and a stack of his data sheets. He sat on the ground in front of them and started talking. He talked about the thermal conductivity of quartz. He talked about the long-term survival of the valley. He told them that he wasn't trying to be better than them. He was trying to find a way for all of them to survive the next 10 years. He offered to help them source stones for their own farms. He offered to lend them his spreader. One by one, the men sat down. The bags of soot were forgotten. By dawn, they weren't vandals, they were students. The validation reached its peak during the Great Weigh-In in September. The entire county gathered at the grain elevator to see the results of the Henderson harvest. The atmosphere was that of a trial. When the first truck from the Henderson farm pulled onto the scale, the silence was absolute. The grain was inspected. The moisture content was a perfect 14%. The protein levels were 3 points higher than the national average. The weight was staggering. As the numbers flashed on the digital readout, a cheer didn't go up. Instead, there was a collective gasp. Marcus had produced 362 bushels per acre. To put that in perspective, the previous record for the county, set during a year of perfect rain and mild temperatures, was 210. Marcus had nearly doubled the all-time record during the worst drought in a century. He could have used the moment to settle old scores. He could have laughed at Silas Miller and the others who had called him a madman. He could have charged a fortune for his technical data and the use of his specialized machinery, but he didn't. He stood on the back of his truck and announced that the Henderson Farm was now a public research station. He declared that every farmer in the plateau was welcome to his blueprints, his soil samples, and his mineral sources. He realized that in a world of rising temperatures, the only way to survive was to build a community that was as resilient as his soil. The legacy of the white stones transformed the very architecture of the region. By the following year, the Henderson shimmer could be seen across the entire valley. The technique was adapted for different crops. Orchardists found that by placing white stones in a ring around their trees, they could prevent the sunscald that killed young bark. Vineyard owners found that the reflected light improved the sugar content of their grapes, while the cool soil preserved the acidity. The economy of the plateau, which had been on the verge of collapse, began to boom, but the true legacy was philosophical. Marcus Henderson had proven that the human mind, when applied with rigmarole and scientific rigor, could negotiate with a hostile climate. He showed that we don't have to be victims of our environment. He taught a generation of farmers that the soil is not just a medium for growth, but a complex thermal engine that can be tuned. He died in his sleep at the age of 94, his hands still stained with the white dust of the limestone. His gravestone was not made of granite or marble. It was a simple, rough-cut block of white quartz, polished until it shone like a mirror. The final lesson of the Marcus Henderson story is one of perseverance. Innovation is often indistinguishable from madness until it succeeds. The man who covers his field in stones is a fool until the day the sun turns into a killer. Then he is a prophet. Marcus Henderson was neither. He was simply a farmer who looked at the white light of a dying world and decided to reflect it back.